For 3 years now, I have been covering visual novels once a month, every month, without stopping, even if I occasionally have to delay videos due to life events or other things occurring. And something that has become more and more of a priority to me within that time is diversifying. While I enjoy talking about horror games or soap operas or what have you, I think it would get boring if they were all that I talked about. Life needs spice, and I think up to this point I've done a pretty good job with that. We've talked about messy straight relationships and yearning lesbian ghosts, horny messes going at it and asexual kings finding their own identities, casts of misfits having outer space sex adventures and earthbound polycules coping with the future of our world, and so much more. But one topic I've yet to touch on much at all on this channel is the historical drama, and more specifically, drama set in the Taisho era of Japan. It is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and troubling periods of the country's history, being the time in which both the Russo-Japanese and First World Wars began and ended, and the time when Japan was further modernizing and particularly westernizing. Culturally, politically, and socially, it was a time of imperialism and democracy, beauty and grotesquerie, Eastern ideas and Western ideas clashing in ways sometimes incredible and sometimes disgusting. There is much to be written about Yoshihito Taisho's troubled 14 years on the throne, and much already has to varying degrees of historical accuracy. For a time that was filled with as much incredible and awe-inspiring social progress as it was shadows of the past and shadows to come, people certainly have learned to romanticize the best of it and what could have been. But there's just as many people that question what horrors were happening under the scene of imperial glory. One who has caught my attention recently for doing so is author Utsuro Akuta, a regular collaborator of Studio Baseon and writer for former studios 13cm and 130cm. There is a slim chance you're familiar with him for his work on Yuri game Wanting Wings and zombie virus horror in disguise Neko Kwaegari. But what I've found most fascinating in his entire roster are his little-known 2000s works set in Taisho, Japan. The first of these was Lemon Kagete Nostalgia in 2000, a fairly simple game in which its protagonist comes into the ownership of a cafe that acts as a brothel during the nighttime, and he gets to play around with the 5 beautiful women who work there, until eventually love blossoms with one of them, all while learning their backstories and the history of the titular Kagete Cafe itself. While the actual playing experience and content of Lemon isn't anything remarkable, what makes it worth noting against other similar titles of the time is the setting. Utsuro purposefully did no extra research in the Taisho era during development, leading the game to capture a very sentimental and wistful atmosphere that still holds strong, even if the game doesn't have nearly enough meat on its bones. His passion for exploring the Taisho era would not die out with this game, however, as soon after its release, he would team up again with artist Sapporo Momoko and musician Big Dabo to dive far deeper into that troubled time. The tenuous lives of sex workers, the complicated and colonialist relations Japan had to other Asian countries, the lowly business tactics and disputes of the rich, and the challenging sociopolitics which dominated the lives of women. All of this within what I believe are two of the most captivating works to grace the visual novel genre. Canary from 2003 and Boku from 2005, the latter's full title translating to I Am Not an Angel, are two loosely connected games that act like the antithesis to romanticizations of the Taisho era. Rather than solely focusing on aesthetics and beauty of the time and the lives of those privileged to be thinkers and artisans, they instead turn their focus to the growing pains within and outside of Japan, the downtrodden women, the structures of society, the tensions of clashing cultures, and so forth. The first of the two, Canary, released episodically throughout 2001 and 2002 before being compiled in 2003, acts as a deep dive into the life of one particular girl, Kanako Okogi, a heroine from Lemon who appeared there as a shy younger lady with an abusive and complicated background. The focus of her game then is fleshing that all the way out, from the beginning of her life as an innocent daughter of a Japanese aristocrat to the budding of herself after a long and torturous road. Clocking in at less than 3 hours long, Canary is an astoundingly dense read that explores more than one might ever expect from a visual novel of its length. The stark class divisions women face, the internalized misogyny and lack of unification or support, the objectification and brutalization of them by the upper classes, the pipeline of poverty to sex work, and all explored in ways that feel relevant to the modern day with a genuinely heartwarming and interesting conclusion. It's a striking, focused, and poignant game which stands in stark contrast to the broad yet still greatly accomplished scope and goals of Boku Janai, released in 2005, 3 years after Canary's final episode. Following a man named Kitami Ichizo, a fledgling BDSM novelist in a time of great sexual curiosity, Boku chronicles the many different paths his life can take as twists and turns all time back to a mysterious nightclub known as the Masquerade warp his life and the lives of those around him. Delving into many complicated ideas, but most especially the broader scale of class struggles and economic troubles, and the burgeoning fascinations people had of sexual fetishes through the introduction of literature such as Psychopathia Sexualis, Boku is a fascinating game in and of itself that only becomes more powerful with the context that Canary adds. While the two are most definitely separate works that don't need to be taken together, I really do feel like it's worth discussing them in one place because they complement each other thematically and philosophically in a way that's reminiscent reminiscent of Subarashi Hibi and Tsuinosora 2020. One is far broader and longer, while the latter ties up loose ends, so to speak, and has a much smaller scope. And that comparison is warranted beyond even that, as I feel the games have some similar philosophical ideas. What I believe Utsuro's Taisho works are ultimately about, above everything else they explore, is finding hope and acceptance in a careless world. Both games are about troubled people living troubled lives in a troubled era, seemingly without any cause to rally behind, seemingly without anybody who stands behind them, yet ultimately they find people who will lift them up and obtain some sort of peace that made their lives worth living, no matter how unceremoniously they may end. They are works about facing our world head on so we can hope for something better. They are, in my opinion, two of the most fascinating and unique visual novels ever crafted. So, without further ado, let's begin our journey by exploring the story at its proper start, Canary. Aristocracy anywhere in the world is a fragile thing. Ruled by power, money, and influence, those with nobility can fall from grace into destitution in the blink of an eye, given enough carelessness and error. Such is what happened to the Ookogi household, a lineage of nobility that began to crumble when one of the women was married to a man named Kiyoharu, a trader who made his profits on the minor economic boom following the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Kiyoharu had come and gone for their household for many years before marriage, and quickly became loved by everyone within it as a charming and sophisticated man. He was a proper husband for a proper wife adored by all, except the youngest daughter of the home, Kanako. A talented singer and gentle child who knew nothing of the world's cruelty, she could still sense that something wasn't right about him, and what that was didn't become clear until it was too late. Under Kiyoharu's advice, Kanako's father, who accepted him like a younger brother, made a series of terrible financial decisions in the burgeoning stock market that drained him of all the resources left by his aristocratic parents. Subsequently, the family was led into a financial crisis which Kiyoharu was more than willing to help bail them out of as a kind deed to his beloved brother-in-law. Selling everything they had to make do, Kanako's mother and father saw it best to put her in the care of Kiyoharu, as he had the resources to take care of her while they led lives of grueling work, even if it meant she would be away from her family for the very first time in her life. However, even if the offer of a luxurious life soon presented to her by her uncle, Kanako decides she cannot just sit idly like a doll and offers to work as a maid for Kiyoharu to help pay off the debts. With some hesitation and a stern warning not to come back crying if she regrets it, Kiyoharu accepts the offer, and so begins Kanako's days of torture as her innocence is ripped away of the cruel realities of life. Bullied day in and day out by maids who see her delicate personality as something to vent their frustrations with, and manipulated by Kiyoharu into isolation, Kanako's future seems to be one of pain and torture, but something in her keeps her moving forward. Just what is Kiyoharu truly playing at, and what's really happened to her immediate family? Will her life be a tragedy without end, or is there light at the end of the tunnel? And what does it mean to go through a living hell and come out on the other end, if there even is one? For Kanako, the only path is to keep moving forward, even if she doesn't know what awaits her. There is only a hope that there's beauty somewhere in the world. If there is anything that immediately stands out about Canary, besides the intriguing premise and the incredible art and fantastic soundtrack, it's the way it's written. While Lemon just a year before it was styled like a typical visual novel with first-person prose and dialogue abound, Canary takes a distinctly different approach in that it's written like a play. That might sound wild at first, and it kinda is just for its rarity, but when you consider what visual novels are, it starts to make a lot more sense. Because visual novels aren't just words on a page, the way they're written is often fundamentally different from a standard novel. For better and worse, there are many exceptions to this, but many of the best writers are able to merge the oral, visual, linguistic, and interactive to create something that delivers info down multiple lanes at the same time with incredible efficiency. As a result, the prose of visual novels has a far lessened burden to explain in words what's happening, leaving room for less objective forms of narration to flourish, and more of the who does what, when, and wheres in code for objects to perform, kind of like a play. And Canary reveals this much simply by pulling back the curtain on what would only be seen in code. Scene changes and environment names, directions for what is where and how to emote, the types of stances people should take, and so forth are clearly conveyed through instructions to actors. To this day, I've seen very few authors actually take this angle, which I think is because the weird novel-screenplay hybrid writing that visual novels are able to perform is one of the genre's most defining features and greatest strengths. But I like seeing authors try new and different things, and I can't think of any games that attempt this besides Canary and Boku, and Suisenka, I guess, but that jumps between narrative styles constantly create unease within the reader, so maybe that doesn't count. Or maybe it does. Watch my video on it and find out, it's good. The story itself is even explicitly, not implicitly, segmented into the traditional 3 acts of exposition exposition, complication, and resolution, which is as much an artistic decision, it seems, as a result of how the game was released, being a series of bonus pack-ins with other 13cm titles. It wasn't until 2003 that the game was released alongside Lemon in a single box set and tidied up in the one neat package. From purely aesthetical and stylistic levels, the decision to go all in on the playstylings rather than be more typical VNs makes the game feel familiar yet like nothing else in the genre besides Bokutan. This more sparse style of prose has a feeling of indifference to the world itself too, which thematically feels very relevant to the focus on man-made social injustices. Plus, the terse and quick directions give some much needed room for the rest of the writing to breathe, as both the dialogue and narration are dense with how much character building is put into each and every line. Everyone has a distinct and clear voice with speech that reflects their personality, and the narration, provided primarily by Kaneko and rarely by a third person, often feels very noir. It's grim, reflective, and like a journal, quite purple as far as prose goes as well, with a wide vocabulary and distinct flair that still always feels clear, indicative of the emotions of the characters. The cast of Canary does an excellent job at feeling a lot larger than it actually is. Though there are technically over a dozen named characters throughout the story, there's really only 3 who play a constant role in it. Our heroine, Kaneko Ookogi, her uncle, Kiyoharu Ookogi, and the head of the maids, Kie Sakae. Together, along with the other smaller and periodic actors, they make up the larger social web that leads Kaneko's life in the varying directions it takes. As the sole child of an aristocratic family, kazoko being the proper Japanese term, she is, at heart, an innocent and loving person. She's sweet, gentle, accepting, and extremely hardworking, willing to do just about anything to support the people she loves, which, of course, is a part of how her uncle takes advantage of her. Her character undergoes some massive development as the plot progresses, and she's forced to see just how much her upbringing has sheltered her from the cruelties of the world, particularly how women were often treated in the Taisho era. While the era was one that saw pushes for reforms and activism, much of which would go on to have major positive impacts for the whole of Japanese society, the material reality for many women at that time was far from ideal. The concept of a good wife, wise mother was continuing to gain importance, and middle-class and greater women were encouraged to produce as many children as possible for the glory of the empire. In fact, the social systems actively opposed anything else for them.
When a woman graduates from a woman's higher school, it is believed that she no longer needs any formal education. The reason is that a woman is not even regarded as a social entity. Sooner or later, a woman must leave her father's home. She is forced into a new family where the despot this time is the husband. Of course, she does not go as an equal, but as an appendage of the husband. She has nothing to call her own. The woman, who is inferior in terms of education, skill, and physical endurance, cannot become independent even if she so desires.
Even the choice of who a woman's partner would be was left up to those of greater power. It wouldn't be until the 1960s that the traditional method of the family arranging partnership opportunities, omiai, would start to equalize with love marriages and then dwindle. The primary purpose of marriage and sexual activity was, after all, to quote historian McClelland, at least for the bourgeoisie women, organized entirely around reproduction, end quote. Those who were not bourgeoisie were generally expected to be laborers, and the empire saw them as inherently inferior by blood and thus not desirable for propagation. Most particularly, they were encouraged to engage in the sex trade with state-sanctioned brothels to regulate pregnancies and ensure the health of the men who biologically needed to relieve their urges. Why don't they just masturbate, you ask? Well, according to a government member in 1931, that is a leading cause of respiratory disease, so it's preferable to regard poor women as capital instead. Awesome! In simpler words, shit was fucked up bad, and the way structures of power and discrimination manifest in people's prejudices and beliefs are at the core of what happens to Kaneko throughout the story. What starts as a cheerful and fragile girl quickly turns into somebody scared and weary, somebody who is deeply traumatized by the overwhelming cruelty of a misogynistic and controlling world and simply wants to survive. Even knowing the story will have a happy ending, you can't help but get invested in the moment-to-moment drama because it's so gripping and plays so effectively off of politics from the era. Whether you know them in depth or not, they are so very cleverly worked into the fiction that even the unfamiliar can tune in and feel like they have a grip on the characters and their motivations. This is maybe most prominent in the characterization of one of the two main antagonists, so to speak, Kie, a maid born to poverty who leads all the others at Kiyoharu's estate. She is sadistic, cruel, and without any hint of a truly kind side, but the game quickly elevates her from a one-note villain to a tragic figure for the allegories to real-world politics. She sees Kaneko not as a woman forced into squalor and labor and thus disadvantaged like her, but an aristocratic woman by birth and forever, as the kind of intersectionality we think of now wasn't really a thing in Taisho Japan. There was not a class of women, there were poor women and rich women, good lives and lowly brothel workers. Ultimately, the stratification bred antagonism, as middle-class women only cared for each other's problems, and the poor women held both frustrated jealousy and longing admiration of the upper classes with them. Kie's entire characterization is fueled by this peculiarity, and all of her actions, which get progressively more brutal and degrading throughout the game, are based on this conflicting whirlwind of desire and anger. She was not born this way, but shaped shaped by a misogynistic and discriminatory society that has led her to trip on the power Kiyoharu gives her, all in hopes of reclaiming some meaningful place within the world. I do not mean to say that all this is unique to Taisho Japan, however, because statistically, most of you watching this video don't have to look beyond your home country to see this kind of stratification. My home country of the US is a hotbed of this, where people do not see the overlap between the issues of various social groups even within given boundaries. Cis women do not need to worry about the problems of trans women, one racial minority does not need to worry about other racial minorities, and so forth, as commentators say. In reality, however, many of the struggles we have now are not isolated problems, but manifestations of larger systems. For instance, the way emotions are seen as weak is tied directly back to the degradation and persecution of so-called feminine behavior, which itself ties back to a broader system of misogyny and discrimination. Those systems are the same ones used to degrade and demean trans women for not being feminine enough or for being failed men, which in turn is used against all women who appear too masculine, which is statistically and socially far more applied to women of color than it is to white women because of other pre-existing prejudices. Likewise, many of the issues that women face within the Taisho era stem from a core system of patriarchy and misogyny where men are the only capable figures and women exist merely to satiate and create more of them. Different classes had different struggles for certain, and that has not changed in all this time. But whether by being forced to lead a life of domestic submission or work at a brothel, the root cause for women's discrimination then was primarily tied back to systems of imperial power. This too comes up within the characterization of Kiyoharu as a villain, who knowingly takes advantage of every opportunity he gets to obtain some sort of social status and power. He built his financial empire on cruel business tactics, often driving competitors out of business through underhanded methods. He even at one point led a competitor to suicide and took his daughter in as a maid. And to paraphrase the game, she is to him like the trophy of a dead animal on display. Suffice to say, the game uses him to play very heavily into demonstrating the level of social power wealthy men were allowed to hold at that time, and not at all subtly. It's clear from the beginning that he is an absolute piece of shit manipulating so many things and has basically no redeemable qualities, which makes him quite different from the complex characterization of Kie, but the metaphors still ring true today since scummy businessmen are, well, scummy businessmen. He really is one of those you love to hate him type of villains who gets away with some truly heinous shit while fooling everyone around him, talking hollowly about Kanako being his beloved niece while facilitating her getting beaten and battered by the people working under him, and not getting his comeuppance until the damage is already done, though it is one hell of a spectacle when it happens. Even these side characters feel like they have substantial depth compared to the minimal amount of screen time they're given. Kiyoharu's other maids, for instance, are shown to have much more varied reasons for engaging in torturing Kanako. Some are simply immature like kids who don't understand the impact of their bullying, while others enjoy getting back at the upper class without necessarily the same level of scorn and anguish that Kie feels. Besides them, there's a handful of other characters who pop up throughout. There's Shizuyo, the sole maid who supports Kanako before Kie puts a stop to that, as well as characters from Lemon turning up towards the end, one of the most tearjerker endings I've seen in a while. Add onto that a ton of supporting actors in other various roles, and you have a cast which feels truly fleshed out. Speaking of things that are good and well done, Canary's art is absolutely fantastic, which should be no surprise given that it was done by Sapporo Momoko. Fans of the channel might recognize that name, as she was a supporting illustrator on the bizarre and wonderful Ayayo-san series and the lead artist for the incredible Suisenka. She also worked on the music for a bunch of stuff I covered, including those, something of which we'll get back to in the Bokuten segment. As far as visual novels go, and particularly those from the late 90s to early 2000s, the basic aesthetic ideas which Canary is built on are pretty typical and in the vein of what Leaf popularized through titles like the previously covered Shizuku and Kizawato, filtered sepia-tone photographs as backgrounds with stylized anime sprites placed on top for characters. However, it's in the execution that things are really special. Canary's illustrations feel vivid with strong shading and coloring. Bright colors pop against thick outlines and shadows of pure black, with highlights placed carefully to invoke feelings of strength and weaknesses within the characters, all coming together in something that's kind of like manga mixed with comic books. Expressions are emotional and impactful, while poses give a feel for how a character conducts themselves at a mere glance, and the photographs blend in seamlessly with the attention-grabbing portraits, making for a cohesive appearance that few games with this style manage to accomplish. If I had to describe it succinctly, I would say that Momoko's art here is punchy, or perhaps attention-grabbing. This goes for the CGs too, which are often absolutely gorgeous and generally fall in the same vein, though there is a bit of variation in the coloring and shading quality, as more people than just Momoko handled filling in the line work. It always looks great, however, even if it's not as stylish 100% of the time, so I don't mind the shifts in quality and style as much as I have with other past covered games. I would be remiss to talk about the art without giving attention to the character designs as well, and particularly how unique they feel. There's no over-the-top proportions, bombastic hair colors, or anything like that. Everything is kept in the realm of the strictly realistic, with stylings that, appropriate for the time, blend vintage European aesthetics with traditional Japanese stylings. The game just oozes style all over, and even now it looks incredible so long as you use a tool like Magpie to scale it up to modern resolutions, since the game itself runs at 640 by 480. It also plays surprisingly great despite its age thanks to running on the ever-sturdy Real Live engine that powered most of Key's famous titles, with many of the modern QL 12 features you could expect. And that's really all I can ask for from a VN, especially when distributed episodically as a freebie, with classics such as Office Sluts and Schoolgirls in Heat 2. Wait, there's a first. Of equal quality to the art is the soundtrack to this game. Composed by someone only known as Big Tabo, which sounds like the name of the least threatening mob boss you've ever known, it is an absolutely astounding score that gels amazingly with the game, even if not all of it was originally made for this game. Around 7 of the 18 tracks in Canary are borrowed from Lemon, which, while normally a little bit harsh on music reuse and stock music use on this channel, I think this is one of the few games that actually gets it right. It ends up feeling like a way for the games to tie themselves together without any compromise to the game's own identity, which is the issue that typically plagues asset reuse, and the implementation of it is just as good as the composition themselves. The soundtrack almost exclusively uses computerized orchestral sounds provided by distinctly early to mid-90s sound modules, lending an air of artificial sophistication, I suppose is the best way to put it. Strings, harpsichords, pianos, all of it is brilliantly programmed, but just the tiniest bit away from feeling genuine. And for a game that deals heavily in the hollow lavishness of the rich, it's some pretty sweet thematic cohesion. By far and away, my favorite track has to be The Site of the Tragedy. It's a beautiful and mesmerizing waltz in the traditional 3/4 time that has Tabo really flexing their classical theory muscles. Counter melodies dancing with each other as rhythmic intrigue is created through changes in articulation, and the mood jumps from intense to playful in an instant. The rest of the soundtrack is wonderful too, with some particular standouts being The Girl Doll with its incredible crescendo and haunting lead-up, and Chant of the Moon with its solemn melodies for harps and strings. A ton of it honestly reminds me of Umineko's score, especially the works that Lakanriki contributed like Golden Sneer and Smile is Saray, with a kind of contemporary and European classical fusion that leans far more on the latter. It's also worth noting that, as was starting to become more and more of an expectation for visual novels at the time, Canary features a partially voiced cast. No men as per usual for VNs, which is a bit of a shame, but everyone here does a fantastic job with their roles, even though I couldn't quite tell you who those people are because nobody's credited. I searched all over for any info online on Gamebox's supplementary materials, even the game CD for README or something, which never turns up anything, and all I got was this beautifully 1990s test video for seeing if a computer can handle video playback. Oh, thank God, I was worried about that. Okay, that's not all I got, because I know Tanaka Michi likely returned from Lemon to play Kanako, also known for Best Girl Coyote and the previously covered Sayoshi, and Maki and Natsuyume Nagisa. But besides that, zilch, nada. It wasn't particularly uncommon for voice actors to go uncredited during this era of eroge, but I still can't help but wish for more given the incredible performances everyone provides. Still though, Canary is on the whole an amazing experience, and I think now is time to dive into spoilers in order to explain exactly why, and set the stage for what comes next in Bokuden. Though unlike usual, I won't buffer this with a Patreon segment quite yet. That'll be in between the two games proper. So if you would like to skip spoilers, then go ahead and jump right into that segment and then continue on the Bokuden. But if you're here for the whole ride, then, well, let's see the tragedy unfold, shall we? I described earlier that I see the duology of Utsuro's digital Taisho plays as being about two things, hope and acceptance, both in a world that seems as if it allows for neither. While Bokuden and Canary both contain elements of these two ideas, I feel that each hones in on a specific one more than the other, and Canary drives its focus towards the idea of hope against all odds. As mentioned in the synopsis, Kanako's life takes a very negative turn quite quickly. What starts as a comfortable life afforded by her aristocratic family, joyous days of singing and dancing, it crumbles before long in a destitution and a desperation to escape debt, with her working as a maid alongside others who regularly berate and torture her. As a demure woman of an upstanding social origin, she is an easy target for the bullying, no matter how truly fucked her situation actually is, and how little she actually has to do with the world of aristocracy. Like, I am generally the first to be criticizing rich kids, but Kanako, and apparently her father for that matter, are people who just legitimately do no harm to anyone and have no concept of what their standing in society is. Still, though, the only friend that Kanako is able to make during this time is another young maid by the name of Shizuo Takasaki, who, just like her, had her upper-class family destroyed by the financial schemes and planning of the greedy and powerful Kiyoharu, and was taken in by him ostensibly as a maid. In reality, however, she is merely a reminder to himself of the power he possesses over others, a trophy of his conquests. But none of the other maids particularly seem to care about where her and Kanako are in their lives now, as debt-ridden people separated from their family with nothing to return to. And Kie in particular holds a strong grudge against Kanako for being part of the class that stole the most precious thing in the world away from her. While there are strong implications that it's something sexual, we never learn exactly what it is, and I think the story is all the better for leaving it vague. It forces the player to accept whatever it is and leaves very little room open for players to debate if her pain is rational or not. All we know is that something hurt her deeply, and her way of expressing it is in a grotesque power high that at best gives temporary satisfaction, and at worst it just perpetuates the structures that put her in the position she's in now. The first scene in the game opens in media res with exactly this. All the other maids besides Shizuyo following Kie's lead in harassing Kanako, before Kie herself escalates the situation once the game returns from the monologue to present time. Seeing an opportunity, she ties Kanako down to a chair and calls Shizuyo in to watch her quake in fear, threatening her so strongly with violence that she has a fit of incontinence, and degrades them both by forcing Shizuyo to clean up after Kanako for shamelessly soiling a priceless rug. It is a brutal and horrifying moment, and perhaps the strongest part of it is how much it hones in on Kie's conflicted psyche. I talked earlier about the mixed admiration and hatred that women of lower classes often held towards the middle and greater classes for effectively abandoning them because they did, and nothing symbolizes that better than Kie as she tortures both of the maids and says along the lines, "What makes the aristocracy any different from those vulgarly and wretchedly copulating like animals?" It is a tantalizing and painful moment of someone almost realizing how they're being led into prejudice despite being people all the same, but ultimately rejecting it all to produce sadistic pleasures and get revenge, which from a development standpoint is some powerful and startling characterization, and from a more metaphorical standpoint it shows how difficult it can be to accept that perhaps maybe you share things with the people you don't want to, maybe you share struggles and problems with them, and perhaps there's strength in joining together, but accepting this would mean tearing yourself away from the worldview you've held and would mean viewing your traumas in a new light. It takes any clear perpetrator away from the world and forces you to fight against something far vaguer, far more knowable, and far grander. And for Kie, someone who was born in the squalor and lost everything, the kind of anger she holds is something which gives her meaning and at its core is not wrong. The people who create the conditions of poverty and misogyny are those with the most social power, and that means those with wealth, assets, and influence, i.e. the aristocracy of the world. And Kiyoharu is quite aware of this, brazenly showing Kanako to others as an aristocratic daughter, while simultaneously hiding how she has nothing. But Kiyoharu is effectively able to use her as misdirection to save his hide. It turns Kie's anger towards someone that she could be joining with, but instead is now reduced to a venting post. Villains exploiting those with less standing than them to create antagonism is by no means a unique plot device, but what I find so fascinating here is the way it's reworked into a metaphor for how the rich and powerful pit disadvantaged peoples against each other in order to turn them away from having potential allies. A particular real-world example that comes to mind as election time for the United States rolls around is the discourse of the good versus the bad immigrants, the people who go legally versus those who don't, the people who create jobs rather than those who take them. The dichotomy only really exists to create an artificial divide between people who, in both a social and sometimes legal sense, are seen as part of the same class in the US, unwelcome invaders. The goal of a good versus bad immigrant divide is not to encourage good behavior, but it is, like all other constructed divisions of marginalized classes, meant to divide social power into weakened groups who fight each other, rather than the systems of racism, patriarchy, and general control. But Kie, for all of Canary, doesn't see how she's being divided from those who can help her, and most certainly not here. She stops just shy of ripping Kanako's hymen with a broom when Kiyoharu shows up, his curiosity piqued by the tortured screams coming in from the living room. This is the first time we're introduced to him in the game being clear about his interest in Kanako as effectively a toy for him to strut around, happily handing her off to the other maids to train for her good as a developing young woman. She is, after all, his beloved niece, and he simply wishes the best for her. Fucking goddamn bastard. And so marks the introduction to the second act of the Canary, with Kanako's torture continuing at the hands of everyone employed by Kiyoharu, shy of Shizuyo, who now avoids Kanako out of shame and sadness for how powerless she was to help her, something which Kanako does not blame her for. She is, after all, in her words, someone who has suffered enough. No one could blame her for this. The majority of the chapter's first half is essentially a long monologue where Kanako recollects and describes her feelings about everything that's happened, and one of the most poignant parts of the game. You see how truly far Kanako's empathy extends of Shizuyo and how deeply she's been hurt, and yet despite it all, she still found a hope to grasp onto in her life, that perhaps if she kept waiting, her father would come and save her. Even the slightest hope was a guiding light for her, at least until that hope was torn from her on the night of a certain party. Lavish, luxurious, and decadent, it is everything one would expect from a shallow rich man's party, and Kanako was destined to take the center stage. Kiyoharu's interest in taking Kanako to the party was as a prop to show off, as she had long been a talented singer and dancer, and desiring to curry favor of other rich people by showing what a beautiful and talented family he was so graciously helping to care for, prettied her up so she could perform on stage. But to both his and her own surprise, believing she could not sing anymore, after some hesitation, she began to sing again just as she did during her happiest days. It's one of the most beautiful and powerful scenes in the game for what it symbolizes. Despite everything she had gone through, despite everything that she was about to go through, there will always be some part of her that stayed untouched. Something that anybody, even the most cruel and horrible, could not deny in her, and something that she, no matter how broken her spirit may become, could not deny in herself. I've talked immensely on this channel about the power for even the smallest things to carry someone through terrible times, and this scene serves as one of the most powerful crystallizations of that. Summarizing and expanding on the game really doesn't do justice to just how much tragic pain it's able to pack into the hour and a half of reading time up to this point, with her having lost her family, her only friend, her sanctity, and just about everything else. And yet, despite all of that, there's a fragment of her that remains untouched, a fragment of her that keeps hoping. It's a bit of a different angle to go at this from, because typically on this channel I've talked about this idea as people holding on the bright little spots in an otherwise painful world. Boku goes into specifically this, but Canary takes an equally meaningful approach by showing that no matter what you endure, there will always be a part of you that is untouched. Despite everything, you will still be you, even if you can't see that at the very moment. And there's something deeply resonant in that to me as I looked back to where I used to be a mere 7 months ago. Where I was living was, for the most part, terrible for my mental health, and my interests regularly got caught in the crossfires. The passion I have for my music, my language studies, my work, and my writing were all targets of outrage at some point for varying reasons. There were a lot of points that I felt I should really just give up on these endeavors and continue down the same path as everyone else, and lock away the hobbies that seemed to cause jealousy and frustration to surface in people I thought close to me once. But I think there's a deep passion to express myself and create that, as evidenced by the channel going on non-stop, never disappeared, and is in fact what kept me going through it all. No matter what I faced, and I faced a lot, those parts of me could never be taken away, nor touched in any way meaningful. And in that sense, I resonate a lot with this scene. Try as people did to break me, somewhere in there is an indomitable spirit of horniness and passion for what I love that defines me, and the most anyone could ever do was push it down for but a flicker of time. Though Kanako would eventually see a piece that would allow her to pursue her joy as such, it would not be anything soon after the party. Lured into her uncle's office by the promise of an opportunity to call her father as a reward for an incredible performance, that hope is soon dashed when he reveals his version of the truth. She can never go back to him because her father sold her out. He got himself into massive debt through his own foolish decisions in a dog-eat-dog world, and Kanako being sent over was not an act of mercy, it was an exchange of goods. In other words, he sold his own daughter to bail himself out. Though it sounds insane and cruel to a layman, to Kiyoharu, the reasoning is sound. Kanako's father, like Kiyoharu, is aristocracy. To be such of high social status is to live for power. It is to obtain all that you can for whatever means necessary in order to show yourself as stronger than the rest. Humans, capital, product, cold cash are all merely pawns on a board for the wise men to outwit the fools with, and to flaunt as symbols in a never-ending game. In no uncertain terms does Kiyoharu define what Kanako is to him in this moment, as he forces her into a collar, chain, and a white dress. She is his object, a prop for his own theater of shallow, affluent spectacle. And to Kie, who before long joins in by his side to aid in the torture, the girl now in collar and chain is a living testament to the fact that the aristocracy is no different from the poors. They too can be reduced to mere animals, serving another's will with no freedom of their own. Given the reins by Kiyoharu to do as she pleases, Kie takes his hunting rifle and assaults Kanako with it, soiling the virginal white dress with her blood. Finally, for once, she, as a poor woman stripped of her humanity and rights simply by birth, has stolen the most precious thing to a woman of nobility, the proof of a body's purity. With this, Kie proclaims, I will make you a woman. Violated and broken, Kanako is slammed to the ground once again when Kiyoharu decides to take his turn and complete what Kie has started, forcing her into submission so that he knows every part of her is owned by him. From her blood to her tears, from her flesh to her mind, she exists as nothing more than a pet, property, a toy. And yet, despite it all, once the horrible disgrace is over, Kanako finds the strength to escape and enters a life in the shadows of society. There is an immense amount to unpack of the ending of Canary's second episode, and I suppose there is no better place to start than with Kie's declaration and act of defloration. It is the line in the game that struck me the most, and to understand why, one needs to understand the power which virginity itself held not only within this time, but even now. To quote Barbara Sato's translation of Taisho era thinker Chibakameo on the role of marriage, if a young woman wants to make a good life for herself today, she has to be patient and do her utmost to find the best possible partner she can in the world. That is the person she will give her heart and body to. Because of the need to devote oneself totally to one another, virginity is a woman's treasure. The same thing holds true for a married woman. A husband and wife realize that in this whole wide world they are the only two who matter, and they must be willing to give everything to each other. Kie's declaration then serves twofold. The first is a complete negation of Kanako's assigned purpose in a society. To lose her virginity is to lose her treasure, her value of proof to a man, and thus is to doom her to innately being viewed as lesser, as dirty and impure, in the same way that women of lower class were, often for just being born that way. Purity culture like this, and how it more broadly leaks out into the ways we view relationships and people, is something I've spoken about numerous times on this channel, most notably in my videos on Dokusei, Manakashi, and Bichoujo Mangekyo, but it's one that I don't think will ever stop coming up because it is so deeply woven in the fabric of how countless societies view women with consistently horrifying effects. I am not speaking from a purely academic standpoint on this either. I've felt firsthand the consequences of how much we fetishize virginity and purity. The person who would end up molesting me was deeply obsessed with the fact that I'd never had penetrative sex before, and all throughout my life really, I've had people who honed in specifically on my virginity, either as a one-of-a-kind sexual property to take as a trophy, or as proof that I'm acceptable as a partner. Put in broader terms, women who are inexperienced are fetishized as trophies to collect, youthful icons who haven't completed their transition into womanhood, and women who are experienced are fetishized as hypersexual and less fit to be partners. This is still something I struggle with getting out of my head from time to time, that my body is inherently worse for having lost its purity outside of a relationship, and the fact it wasn't of my own will adds even more insult to injury. It's nonsensical, given that I would never think of applying that standard to anyone else, but brains are hypocritical and stupid. Women should be allowed to be sluts who can be happily married and start families, with multiple partners even. Men too, and non-binary people. Anyways, this fetishism is what sets the stage for Kie's acts to have as much power as it does, and to even be considered an act that makes Kanako a woman, which leads to the second and equally important point that the sheer brutal suffering of the scene acts as a powerful metaphor for how becoming a woman is an innately painful thing inside of a misogynistic society. Far more and far stronger than with men, society inundates women with messaging and supposed roles that effectively just chastise us for existing, especially when we're not really considered adults yet and thus don't have our own agency. While I can't really speak for what it's like growing up being perceived as a woman because I was a socially isolated homeschool, I wasn't fucking perceived at all. I did begin my transition and further ventures out into the world around age 19, which meant I got to have a solid 2 years of people not seeing me as a proper adult. Those 2 years were a revealing time for me because I got to see in my own eyes the shift in perception people had of me as I became more and more viewed like a woman rather than an adventurous little gay twink trying to strike it big in the world. I became acutely aware of all the things I was supposed to be and all the things I wasn't supposed to be. I faced even greater harassment than I had before because while being androgynous but still a guy afforded me kind of a shield, being out and out as a trans woman meant that I was demeaned both as an incapable woman and as a failure of a man. I have it much better these days, being someone who pretty much passes perfectly in her day-to-day life and also being married to a cis man, but that doesn't mean I didn't suffer unnecessarily in order to get here, nor that I am blind to the pains of those more dehumanized than I am, or even how my combination of socially codified femininity and trans exoticism is its own continuing recipe for harassment and fetishization. If my life was tribulous before transition, then transition certainly added as much joy and peace as it did exposure to the way in which I was expected to feel pain if I wanted to be a woman. Being raped, being coerced, being manipulated, being demeaned, being assumed inferior were all parts of becoming a woman that the few women in my life echoed as unfortunately natural parts of the process. And to be completely clear, none of this is natural. It's all codified in laws and social roles and systems which are all man-made. Pun intended, but even now, and especially back in the roaring 20s across different quote-unquote developed cultures, part of becoming a woman in the eyes of other people was submissively accepting the small and large ways in which society would torture you. It meant accepting your inferiority to men and others with a higher standing, lest you be defeminized or branded as a mentally ill hysterical nymphomaniac, according to one commenter in Taisho Japan. Actually, no, that's me. I'm the mentally ill, hysterical nymphomaniac. That's me! At any rate, I think the sheer brutality of the scene captures in one fell swoop the kind of pain and suffering that exists under a regime of misogyny. It is cruel, unyielding, and brutal, and shows how even fellow women can be pitted against each other if offered a chance to escape that regime, if even for just a second before that power is ripped away by the one who gives it to you. While I don't believe Kiyoharu's role in this scene as the intermediary of power and the ultimate usurper of it comes of as much complexity as Kie's particularly fucked dynamics, his role here still serves mentioning for how it shows the brutality and control that the laws of men held over women during this time in not just the Taisho period, but many parts of the world. Quoting historian Barbara Sato once again, summarizing the thoughts of thinker Hirabayashi Hatsunosuke.
From a young girl's formative years in her parents' home, through her student years, and as a young bride and mother under the control of her husband and parents-in-law, the Meiji Civil Code defined a woman's options. Nature did not will the loss of a woman's creativity, the Civil Code did. As long as the code remained intact, The emancipation of women was but an illusionary dream.
The reality then, as it long was and has been, was that women were exactly what Kiyoharu saw Kanako as, property and trophies to either serve men as parts of a farce of nobility or as reliefs to irrepressible biological urge, highs of power and control cloaked in words of biological determinism and national glory. Though it has improved immensely from how Hirabayashi described it in 1920, that women and workers comprise a class of slaves, it is still true, as he says in the latter half of that quote, that both of them are miserably oppressed. While the mistreatment of Kanako appears extreme, it is in many ways a manifestation and metaphor for the kind of violence that was acceptable in law. This was a time when women could not be adulterous, but men could. Women could not leave a marriage, but men could. Women were property, but men were not. Women were denied education, but men were not, and so forth. Everything that happens is because of the systems that were, but that is not to say happiness couldn't exist in spite of them. And so we enter Canary's final act. Fleeing Kiyoharu's manor with the first chance given, Kanako has found herself without anything, making do for some of the only work afforded to women without prestige or family, the sex trade. Jumping from brothel to brothel, she finally manages to settle into one known as Gold, working without any regulation or license to keep her marginally safe. The clients of it are, perhaps far more so than the brothel sanctioned by the government, crude and uncaring, and those running it are equally as disinterested in Kanako as anything but a source of profit. The owner is insulting, seeing her as a brat who can't appreciate his favor of taking her in, and the janitor regularly sees it fit to enjoy himself with her, though he at least shows the tiniest fraction of empathy to her. Reading a newspaper, he turns to her and says, quote, "You and I were born under some piss-poor stars. If we had the chance, it would have been nice to be born as an aristocrat, don't you think, little lady?" End quote. But it is within that same paper that a far worse realization would come to light. In the headlines, it reads that the mansion of Kiyoharu Kogi has burned down, and Kanako's father with it. In the time that Kanako was away from her home, her father, Sosuke, had figured out what was happening all along with his daughter and the crisis the family fell into, and went by himself to the manor to confront the bastard that took everything away from him. With rifle in hand, Sosuke cornered Kiyoharu, and the man facing his last moments pleaded for them to talk it out as adults. But the words fell upon deaf ears, and the darkness of the barrel drew ever closer. As fate would have it, however, a gust of wind blew the cold hard cylinder of metal and powder away from its target and into a gas lamp. In an instant, the room went ablaze. The two brothers, facing their last moments, fell to the ground with Sosuke on top. Once again, and for the last time, the gun was pointed at the man whom Sosuke once called brother. He could only utter one thing, as fire consumed all and his finger slid onto the trigger. Quote, "Kanako, please grant me your forgiveness." Now knowing that Kiyoharu had lied to her, that her father had loved her all this time and she had been tricked for someone's foolish game, Kanako ran out of the brothel into the streets. Emotions towards her family that were once rage for selling her out turned to sorrow as the truth settled in, and she now felt that she was truly alone in the world. Quote, "It was the same as that night, but the pain and the loneliness swelling inside me had become unhealable scars. I had nothing left to hate. All of it, everything, was gone." Soaked in rain and mud, Kanako wandered aimlessly through the streets, believing there to be nothing left for her in this world. She dashed through cars and people alike, almost losing her life to a driver who just barely hit the brakes in the nick of time. Nearby, an officer pulled her aside and realized what horrible condition she was in, and subsequently, the attention of the lady being chauffeured was taken. That would be none other than Yukie Kiryu, a kind and motherly hostess born to squalor and now working at the Kageete Cafe. Clad in a beautiful kimono and bearing a radiant smile, she appeared like a gentle and loving mother to Kanako, a kind of love and affection which she had thought would never exist for her again in this world. And rather than push Kanako away as everyone else has, Yukie simply held out her hand and grabbed Kanako's tightly. Quote, "This hand I knew would not hurt me. The warmth in this hand which graced my cheek was real. I knew I could trust in it." End quote. And so, for the love of someone who could not bear to see another suffer, for the love of another person who has known what it is like to have nothing, Kanako slowly, with time, built herself and her life back together. She found new friends in the Kageete, and a place she could finally call home again. And soon, she began to sing anew on the stage for all to see. Canary's final act is by length the shortest of the three. While the first two took me around an hour each, Act 3 only clocked in around 35 minutes of an average reading speed. That does not make it any less substantial than what came before, however, as it beautifully cements the message of hope that runs throughout the entire game and puts the final pieces of Kaneko's incredible character together. Throughout the game, we see her as someone with a pure heart and demure personality that regularly gets pushed down by everyone around her, especially during her time as a sex worker, where she outwardly shows complete submissiveness and acceptance of whatever happens to her. And that was the type of personality that those controlling sex workers from Meiji and Taisho Japan found preferable, especially overseas.
Their traumatization was construed in popular discourse as Japanese sex workers being subservient, demure, and obedient, leading to British consumers overwhelmingly preferring them over Chinese and Southeast Asian sex workers. Considering Japanese sex workers' obedience and the fact they usually cooperated with the biopolitical requirements for regular medical examinations, British authorities were in no hurry to restrict the supply of kidnapped Japanese women.
The key word here, however, is traumatization. Despite whatever ways discourse and the third parties may have construed the demeanor of Japanese sex workers, it was not anything innate to them but a survival mechanism to stay alive within the horrible conditions often forced upon them. And Canary plays very strongly into the trauma response framing of demureness on the whole. We see throughout Kaneko's narration time and time again that she is a very smart and resilient person who is well aware of what's happening to her and the injustice of it, and acts as she does because she feels as if there was no other way to survive. Her apparent fragility and demureness isn't framed as being of a poor will or weak, but because it's far easier to fawn rather than fight in times of abuse, and may in fact be the only safe choice. Whenever this subject comes up, especially on the topic of relationships, people always ask why the person being abused, if they were being abused, didn't just fight back, because that's what the prospective naysayer in the situation would have done. But the reality is victims don't react reactionally because of any number of reasons. The perpetrator may control their finances, their social life, their family, they may be significantly stronger. There are any number of reasons why someone chooses to fawn rather than fight, and subsequently it is actually often the rational approach in order to preserve oneself. I almost always chose to fawn when I was in situations of abuse, except in the times where I knew I had an escape or whatever consequences that would come to me would be more preferable than enduring more humiliation. But I knew what was happening to me was wrong on at least some level. I just didn't have the language to express it or the energy to make an escape then, because all of it was going to keeping my soul from shattering. And to be able to keep strong through all that, I believe, is strength in and of itself. It also says a lot that the person who ends up saving Kaneko is not someone that has power over her, but someone who is disadvantaged just like her, if perhaps not even worse. Though it's not particularly explored in Canary, Lemon divulges Yukie's backstory as a poor child who entered sex work for lack of another option, losing her brother to the war drafts and being all on her lonesome while trying to navigate the world. Being somebody who sells sex, she is the exact kind of person that swaths of society believed, and still strongly believe, is unfit to be a mother. And yet, because of who she is and what she knows of the world, she's adeptly aware of the cruelty of it and how to heal a soul shattered by it. She is the first person after Ganako who is torn from her home that shows her true love and warmth, and still continues to support her as if she was her own daughter even after learning more of her history in Lemon. It's not only incredible humanization of a sex worker as a person capable and most importantly worthy of giving love to others, which is shockingly rare, but serves to show that even back in times where people were even more divided than they are now, there were still those who believed that what mattered is where you are and not where you were. Yukie being the one to save Kaneko, rather than someone with far more power or acceptable social status, symbolizes the fact that anybody, no matter how little they have, no matter how much they are dehumanized by the world, has the power to mean everything to somebody else. It is a negation of the beliefs that Kiyoharu espoused and indoctrinated Kie into throughout Kaneko's time in the manor. Power and money may be part of what makes the world go around, but they are not fundamentally what makes the world work. It is merely an invention and farce that money and power are what matter most in the world, and even the weakest of us can take another's hand, lift both them and ourselves up through acts of love and selflessness so they may do it for others. But I believe what this ending ultimately represents is hope, because despite everything horrible that happened to Kaneko, despite the fact that she herself nearly gave up on everything, there was still somebody out there willing to do what it took to save her. Despite the fact that she felt she had lost everything, there was still a part of her clawing to live, and that part would end up becoming what hundreds of people wanted to see from her, a voice that was hers and hers alone, a voice inside of her that believed she could survive and hoped for something better. I want to think that no matter who you are and where you are, that something like that exists in you too, in all of us. Whew! Welcome all, and welcome to the good old Patreon segment. That time of the video to break up emotional moments, give life updates, channel updates, thank the donors and sponsors who make this all possible, answer questions, and shout out some cool folks that you should watch. And for the first of those, there isn't too much to say other than I am fucking blazing hot right now and I want it to get colder here in Sao Paulo, so let's move swiftly on to the next thing, which I do have a decent bit to say about. Those of you who are subscribed to the Patreon will probably know that the game I was supposed to cover this month was not two obscure digital plays, but the sequel to Shin Yukikimi. The original was something I absolutely adored, which makes me very sad to say the sequel is maybe one of the worst things I've had the displeasure of playing this year. I will not fill this entire segment with a huge upset ramble, but the basic gist is that I think it forgoes everything that made the original interesting in favor of an overly ambitious and underrealized progression system, dumb as bricks characters, messy presentation, barely existent themes, and an overall lack of polish that makes it deeply unpleasant to play and frustrating as a fan of the original. Maybe at some point I'll do something in video form involving it, perhaps about the ethics of covering bad games and the minefields that people Christ into influencers have to, or should, be aware of, but as it stands, I simply do not have the desire to discuss the game. I think it worked out better in that way, as I am super happy with this video, but man, what a fucking disappointment. I'm pretty sure I said this before in the King Exit video, since I also mulliganed the planned game for that month there, but it bears iterating again that I cannot be more thankful to my patrons for allowing me the financial and creative freedom to create videos that I am most passionate about and interested in making, rather than ragey clickbait that brings in ad dollars, which I don't get anyways because YouTube won't fucking sponsor me. Seriously, no matter how much any one of you donates to the Patreon or Coffee, thank you so much, because none of this would be possible without you. And as always, I want to continue to give back to the community and people that make this possible by shouting out some people and things that I think are neat, be it things that have been suggested, channels I've been watching lately to need more subs, or whatever else. And if you would like a chance at getting shouted out, then feel free to drop me a line by email, Tumblr, Blue Sky, or the artist formerly known as Twitter, and show me what games, music, podcasts, or whatever else you're working on. I am always looking for new things to check out and shout out, so don't be shy and step on up. Anywho, the first person I want to shout out is Isaac Mayer, a historian out of Washington State, which is my home state, neat, specializing in modern Japanese history, and he runs a neato podcast aptly titled The History of Japan. I stumbled upon it while trying to find research materials for this video, and it's ended up becoming my new favorite thing to listen to while cleaning the apartment, walking around town, or making dinner. Isaac provides well-researched and well-structured dives into various parts of Japanese history with a sense of understated wit that keeps even the most complicated of topics interesting and fun to learn about. Whether it's something like a broad overview of all of Japanese history in his ongoing revised Overlook series, or deep dives into important literary, cultural, or religious ideas, there is something for all levels of knowledge and curiosity, with over 500 episodes to sift through. And hey, it helped make this video possible, so 2 thumbs up for that. The second person I want to shout out is a channel named HBlank, who's recently returned from a long hiatus to keep making videos diving into all kinds of weird and forgotten computer history, from cards to add more RAM to a GPU, to pitting mid-2000s powerhouse graphics cards against each other. It's the exact kind of niche computer content that I can't get enough of, and he provides an amazing style. Each video is smoothly edited with gorgeous camera shots and packed with information about whatever topic is at hand, like benchmarks and curious history tidbits, backed up with great narration and a solid flow. It's certainly made by a computer enthusiast for a computer enthusiast, but I do know my audience has a ton of people in it that are as nerdy about retro and sort of retro computing as I am, so do check it out if any of that sounds up your alley. The fact he only has around 10k subs honestly astounds me. And with all that said, it's time to start wrapping up this segment, beginning with a word from our sponsor, Very OK Vinyl. If you are a fan of game music who's never heard of them, then I'm more than happy to be the one to introduce you to them, as they're a company based out of Ontario, Canada, releasing high-quality vinyl records of visual novel, indie, and other game scores. Brand new this month is the soundtrack to Akai Ito, a much-beloved 2000s Yuri mystery VN with a score by Manyo, who also composed music for Flowers, Baldur's Sky, Kara no Shoujo, and also unavailable for pre-order the soundtrack to Nie no Hakoniwa. Like all of those, it has a wonderful variety of tunes ranging from stylish and cozy to intense and action-packed, making for a fun and varied listen topped off by some killer OP and ED themes. Also coming this month is the first ever vinyl release of music from First Astronomical Velocity, Nitro Plus's fictional band that Super Sonico plays in. Whether or not you're familiar with the company's VNs like Muramasa and Sayano Uta, I am almost certain you have heard of Sonico, and the music she stars in is as fantastic as she is adorable. If you are looking for some peak J-rock, then you need not look any further than this upcoming release. And if either of those happen to catch your interest, or anything else they have like the boppin' tunes of Cotton or the classic score to Steins Gate, then why not head over to veryokvinyl.com and secure yourself some sweet music while supplies last. Every record comes in gorgeous packaging, often with super stylish discs and even sometimes bonus materials, so no matter what you get, you aren't gonna regret it. And while you're there, be sure to check out everything else they have on offer from other brands they distribute. From the soundtracks to anime like Mygo and Death Note, to classic city pop and lo-fi jams, there are hundreds of awesome records to choose choose from for you or a music lover in your life. Again, that is veryokvinyl.com, and thank you again to them for being awesome supporters of this channel. Okay then, it is finally time to close out this segment. I once again want to thank everyone who donates to make these videos possible. This has been my full-time job for a while now, and I seriously cannot appreciate each and every one of you enough for making that possible. It's because of all of you that I'm able to make these videos as often as I do, with as high of quality as I do, all while still being able to lead a happy life that continues to get better as I settle into a groove with my husband here in Brazil. I seriously could not do this if I had to juggle other work besides the odd music commission, so thank you so much. And if you would like to be a direct part in making all of this possible, then consider pitching in monthly by Patreon or Ko-fi, or one time by the latter. In exchange, you'll often get to see videos early, watch without the silly obfuscations, get your name on the side of the screen with these other cool people, ask me questions to answer in this segment, suggest games to cover, see monthly updates, and other neat stuff for a minimum of $1 per month. There is no tier-gated content, and everything is accessible by any donation amount. But if you want to keep watching for free, that is okay too. Watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and especially sharing these videos around is a huge part of what makes them possible. I am simply thankful for any support at all, whether financial or not. And with that said, I think it's time we hop into the second half of this video. So thank you all again, and let's get back to the show. Released in 2005, 3 years after Canary's final episode, Boku wa Tenshi Janai represents a massive leap in scale, scope, and idea. Everything from the core interface to the structure of the story has been expanded upon to create something that is far more stylish, professional, and grand, while still keeping intact the emphasis on social commentary and thoughtful themes that made Canary so captivating. It is also a game that wears its inspirations far more on its sleeves, advertising itself as an old-time S&M novel, which for something set in the Taisho era, I'm sure immediately conjures up the image of a certain writer for the more read viewers out there. One of the most important modern Japanese authors, Junichiro Tanizaki. To say his works are important, let alone to this game in specific, is an understatement. Born in 1886 and living until the old age of 79, Tanizaki was one of the most boundary-pushing and salacious writers of the Taisho era, with works that honed in on the conflict between Eastern and Western ideas, burgeoning concepts of deviant sexuality, and the eccentricities hidden in every corner of everyday life. It is difficult to narrow down what exactly his most famous work is, but maybe the two best known to Western audiences, besides the non-fiction In Praise of Shadows, are Naomi, which detailed the relationship between an idiotic man and a young girl who manipulates him to complete submission, and the Makioka sisters, which deals with the complex life of a wealthy family around the time of the Second World War. Oh, and he also really liked feet.
Needless to say, this pose had Ofumi-san's legs spread wide, pulling her kimono open and exposing her beautiful, lively feet. From the curve of her shin to the tips of her toes. Ever since childhood, I had always been predisposed to gaining abnormal pleasure from the washing of young women's legs, so I had long been infatuated with the splendid curves of Ofumi-san's bare feet.
Tanizaki, in all of his eccentricity and brazenness, became a figure of as much praise as he did controversy, the latter of which probably only further propelled his fame and appreciation among critics at the time and even now. And while I would hardly call myself an expert on Taisho literature, or him in specific, especially since I didn't have the time to go through a lot of his works, I think I can be truthful in saying that there was no one else quite on his level at the time. Dude out there was pretty much just making eroge scenarios in the 1920s, complete with provocative and interesting social themes. Utsuro, it seems, was also quite fond of his works, as Boku-ten, and specifically its self-admitted greater focus on erotica compared to Canary, draws heavily from stories that Tanizaki had written. Not just in characters who mirror some of his most famous works, but in some of the socio-political problems it explores, and the kind of absurdity in the erotica shown, in the general feel of the writing, and even in the protagonist being a novelist like so many of Junichiro's were. Set close to the end of the Taisho period, Boku-ten is primarily centered around the life of a man named Kitami Ichizo. Born into a wealthy family, he one day decided to escape the world of his business-savvy younger brother and ailing father to live on his own, taking the young blind maid, Gomei Danabe, along with him. Now, the two live alone in a small and cluttered home, scraping by through his ventures as a BDSM novelist. One day, however, everything changes when he receives an invitation to a mysterious club known as the Masquerade. Masochism and sadism, bondage and control. It is a club of seedy dealings and wretched shows, where Ichizo happens to meet someone who takes his breath away, a mysterious woman named Zakuro, an extreme masochist who seems to be destined to become a display at the club. Filled with a desire to save her from a life of potential torture, Ichizo burns with resolve to take control of the twisted shows, and perhaps that may be possible with the aid of a businesswoman named Yoshino Midoriko, who finds herself charmed by Ichizo's personality and writings and offers to give him a loan to buy the failing club from its old and crude owner. At the same time as all this is going on, however, Ichizo continues used to get correspondence from a lady named Oka Yunino, a nun at the Rosary Garden Orphanage, loved and cherished by the community, and a past beneficiary of donations from Ichizo. However, her letters began to hint at something darker behind the mask of a pristine and pure woman, desires that her faith could never allow. Just what turns will Ichizo's life take in this ever-evolving web of connections? Will he save Sakura from her fate as a torture performer by himself, or take the hands of Midoriko and learn the depths of her schemes? Will he play a part in Yurino's fall from holy grace, or turn his attention to new entrants on the stage, such as Midoriko's cruel companion Rosa? There are endless ways for life to play out in an era of opportunity, and just as many for it to fall into chaos and depravity. The first thing that is immediately apparent upon playing Boku after Canary is the stark change in pacing. Canary was a rather brisk and compact read, but it was also a very smooth one. Scenes flowed well into each other, with the only delineation that things have changed being the appearance of a monologue or text saying what the new set is. With Boku, however, the game is broken up into clearly separated bite-sized chunks that feel akin to a gacha game story, like Blue Archive or Fate Grand Order. Each story segment begins with the title and number of the chapter and ends with a Fade to Black, with a subsequent segment typically occurring after a gap in time. For instance, a chapter may end with Ichizo being beckoned to the masquerade by a letter, and in the next chapter, the story will have him already there with all the transit skipped. The fact that each of these chapters tends to last 10 minutes at most and 2 at the least gives the game an absolutely breakneck pace that I haven't seen matched anywhere else. There's a constant feeling of progress and momentum that at no point ever stops, even more so than the aforementioned gacha titles due to the complete absence of filler. Whether it is high stakes and brisk encounters, tantalizing and scandalous sex, or dark and thought-provoking character development, the game is constantly blazing forward in a way that makes it hard to put down. Much to my own surprise, I ended up binging the entire 5-hour experience over the course of a single workday with very few breaks during it. Another major way in which Boku differentiates itself from Canary is in the atmosphere of the world. Now, that game was certainly dark and oppressive with how it painted the 1920s, but Boku goes the whole ass mile by showing just how rough the lives of many people both in and outside of Japan was back then. The decrepit state of its colonies, the winding webs of aristocratic wealth and disputes, the horrible labor conditions people were forced into, what minor things Canary used as dressing become fully fleshed out realities in Boku. The game does an incredible job at exploring this throughout its 13 endings, because unlike Canary, which is a completely linear title, Boku features a kind of choice-based branching structure you might be familiar with thanks to 90% of VNs made after 1996. But similar to the previously covered Suisenka, you're clearly shown how all the different paths of the story move forward and branch out, with new paths unlocking only once you've cleared the parts of the chart available up to that point. It's a very linearly non-linear experience since you have some freedom to choose how you go about things, and while I don't dislike more typical figured-out blind types of VN experiences, I find myself getting annoyed by how little sense some of the flags make or how poorly equipped the game engines can be to handle players jumping around, especially in older titles. At least for me, this kind of structure is far more preferable to that, and far easier to sit down and blow through in a slow evening. Another way in which Boku deviates from Canary is in the level and function of the sexual content. I didn't really draw attention to the 18+ scenes in Canary as 18+ content, because there's so few of them and it all feels far more geared towards themes and character development rather than making pee-pee go boing. I'm sure someone out there could write a thesis paper on the innate and constant eroticism of a 2D girl being forced to lick up another 2D girl's pee, and I would be curious to read it, but that person's not me. Like I said earlier, however, Utsuro himself said that he really wanted to hone in on the eroticism with Boku, and it absolutely goes ham on merging the greatest strengths of eroge with the overtop and salacious stylings of a Tanizaki novel, down to the emphasis on the strange and bizarre, exemplified no better than in the Masquerade itself. With performers brought from all over the world and clientele consisting primarily of bloodthirsty rich scumbags who want to watch people get tortured on a stage, it is a decrepit place that mixes unimaginable sadism with then fresh and novel concepts introduced through freshly translated European literature, such as the Psychopathus Sexualis. Quote, downtrodden spoke of the irony inherent in the Taisho popularization of sexology, which ostensibly warned readers about the dangers of perversion and encouraged correct sexual knowledge and practices. Yet despite the fact that perversion was often invoked as the opposite of normality, it was perversion, not normality, that was obsessively enumerated in popular sexology texts. Public interest in perversity fed demand for increasingly detailed and lurid descriptions, and, according to Rodin, what started as prescriptive literature quickly lost the blessings of educators and police, and thus descended into the underground culture. Much of the game reflects the confusion and novelty that presumably surrounded the practice of BDSM at the time. The dark and cruel desires of the Masquerade's clientele demonstrate an intermingling of the brutality of the rich and powerful with newfound forms of sadistic pleasure, while others, such as Yurino, find forbidden joy in the new-to-them forms of sexual expression that better meet their perverse desires. What I find most interesting is the game never really criticized the acts themselves as being weird or unorthodox. For some people, being tied up or whipped is just what does it for them, whether in or outside of a relationship. A far cry from the stigmatization of sexual abnormality that pervaded the time and even pervades now to varying extents in varying cultures. The portrayal and variety of the acts honestly remind me a lot of the previously covered Yame no Koe, just not as a gay. That is a bit sad, but the game still runs a wide enough gamut here that I can accept the compromise. From exhibitionism to extreme masochism to shibari to pet play to femdom to wax play to more typical acts, just to name some, there's bound to be something that appeals to everyone so as long as the rather short length of the seams doesn't bother you. Remember, it's okay to be a pathetic little quick shot that can't last a single minute and enjoys it when women bully you. Okay, I'm sorry, that was mean. Unless you enjoyed it, in which case I'm not sorry, you should pay me for ASMR. My point is that Book 10 scenes are unabashedly, genuinely erotic in a way that feels distinctly vintage and extravagant, but in a way that also functions in terms of story. They demonstrate the ways in which sex is innately linked to all the characters' different lives, representing both their shackles and their freedoms in conflict with each other. Though Canary maintained an illusion of a large cast while only really having 3 major characters in its story, Book 10's cast is frankly gargantuan for how short it is, though it never at all feels hard to know who's who. There are 6 characters who show up throughout it constantly, plus a good handful of important side characters, and a ton of minor characters both named and unnamed who act to build the world out. Of them all, arguably the most important is Kitami Ichizo, our protagonist, and a strikingly well-defined one at that. At least as far back as his first primarily solo project, Lemon, Utsuro has had a talent for creating POV characters who invoke more out of the reader than nods and agreement and opportunities to insert themselves into situations, and Boku continues that trend. Ichizo is a very morally complicated guy to say the least. A staunch introvert and self-proclaimed enthusiast of Western psychiatry, he is at his core a genuinely good person who cares a lot for those around him, even if he can come off as brash and cold. He regularly tries to push against what he sees as injustices, from chastising those in the masquerade for how their performers are treated, to refusing to accept dirty money from his father on a mere principle of where it came from. Because of the situation he finds himself in, however, as a writer of little money and multiple conflicting interests, he makes some very questionable and downright cruel decisions in some of the routes. From selling out his caring and blind maid Kome to buy and save another woman, to caging up people who have wronged him, and at points just straight up attempting murder. Even though the pacing is brisk and fast, none of the decisions ever feel like they come out of nowhere or are underdeveloped. There are very flawed, very human reasons behind them, and Ichizo always tries to convince himself that whatever choices he makes aren't completely terrible. Awful as they may be, you really can't help but empathize with him and wish the dude would just get dealt a better hand than he gets, or at least have to deal with a less chaotic cast in his life. Of the 4 heroines, Zakuro is by far and away the least directly damaging to his circumstances. A kind and beautiful lady with a stunning dragon tattoo on her back, born somewhere uncertain and living life as an impoverished sex worker, she became part of Koichi's life when he saw her for the first time at the masquerade, on display as a prime example of a masochist. How much of that is born out of pleasure or out of self-pity is not immediately clear, however, as she has a deeply ingrained belief that, because of where to whom she was born, her life is effectively worth nothing. While there is much to be read into her branch of the story, from its chilling portrayal of Japan's occupation of Northeast China to questions of the meaning of self-sacrifice, what personally resonated with me the most is the exploration of agency with sex. Can she truly be a self-destructive masochist by nature who lives merely for pain, or is it a delusion induced by society? How would one even begin to separate these things? While it's hard to pick a favorite heroine out of the 4, Zakuro certainly came close in my mind just for the way these ideas are explored, as well as the tragic and emotionally harrowing final branch ending. And note that I did not describe it as a true end there, because there aren't any of those in the game. All 13 of the endings are equally as liable to be canon, and infamously, none of them are good, especially Yurino, who arguably gets some of the worst. She is, like Zakuro, a fascinating character. She lived a peaceful life until the day that the Great Kanto earthquake ripped away everything from her, and since then has spent pretty much every day in the Rosary Garden orphanage, attending Christian sermons and caring for the lost children. She is a perfect and pure nun by all accounts, except for her own, as deep within dwell desires for impure deeds. If it's not clear from the description, her branch deals primarily with the control Christianity attempted to, and still does, exert over women in its more strict sex, and the conflicts that it creates within people. As someone who grew up in a somewhat religious household and under a practically Christian nation, it's a type of plot thread that I always find captivating, even more so here with the emphasis on isolation that's created for restricting people in that way. Perhaps the polar opposite of these two in personality, though, is the duo of Midoriko and Rosa. The former is a shrewd businesswoman whom Ichizo meets at a cafe near the masquerade, and takes a rather strong interest in him for his ventures in the BDSM writing. But beneath that facade lay some far deeper and far darker motivations that take the entire game to unravel, as do the motivations behind her companion, Rosa. Rosa is an absolute little shit, to be blunt, but she's also one of my favorite characters. Her entire existence is wrapped in mystery and doubt even past the ending, being a cruel and sadistic lady who acts with seemingly no regard for anyone else's will or emotions, and changes moods from murderous and violent to cutesy and playful in a flash. Besides those 4 of their dedicated branches, there's a number of other characters who complete the cast. From Ichizo's scummy younger brother and his suspicious business antics to the old and frail owner of the masquerade of his questionable ethics. But perhaps the most notable is Kome, Ichizo's blind maid who works her best to take care of the place. She is sorta a heroine, but also not really. She doesn't have her own branch, but she does get her own epilogue segment that acts as the closest thing this game has to a true ending, which does an incredible job at elevating her from a welcome presence to a fascinating figure. Even before that, however, she's just so cute and lovely anytime she appears. An absolute star of a show if I've ever seen one. She's got a stylish cane, too. On the note of style, Bokuten's artwork follows the standards and ideas that were put forth by Canary. As before, the game's art is primarily a mixture of filtered photorealistic backgrounds with deeply shadowed and striking color anime portraits, with designs that draw from a mixture of 1920s European and classical Japanese stylings as appropriate for the era. In the time between games, however, it's clear that Momoko grew significantly as an artist. As much as I enjoy the varying sepia tones of Canary's backgrounds, I think the decision here to go for a constant grayscale adds a sense of moodiness that fits with the atmosphere, as does the significantly more aggressive filtering. Like a play, the backgrounds feel only like suggestions at a larger environment, comprehensible but still clearly components of a stage, occupied by actors who have learned just that crucial bit more about how to truly play their roles since their last appearance in the theater. The game as a whole has a far greater emphasis on contrast, particularly with darkness and light. So many of the CGs feature them in equal prominence, with shots that can be as mesmerizing as they can haunting and grim, even if them opting for a more typical look of drawn and often colored backgrounds. The overall quality of the rendering and such has seen a great uptick too, along with the number of CGs. There's a whopping 72, with many variations on top of that, most of which are dedicated to the adult scenes. There is a very prominent emphasis in all of them to display the art and emotions of various acts, from stunning symmetry to careful gaps in clothing, gaudy colors to deliberate lighting, embarrassed blushes to pleasured grins of agony, electrifying contortions to deliberate gestures. It's all so thoughtfully constructed in a way that brings even the smuttiest of scenes up from the level of fun and indulgent to mesmerizingly evocative. This is to say nothing of the non-auto CGs as well, some of which have seared themselves in my memory for how emotionally resonant they are. Even the UI has seen an upgrade, and a huge one at that. The text box now has a proper border with fancy buttons for basic functions like accessing the backlog and settings, and all the menus have been highly stylized in a manner that feels very similar to the aesthetics of Suisenka, especially noticeable in the flowchart. Given that the two games were released super close to each other and put their trailers in each other, it's not surprising bits leaked between them and cross-inseminated. Sex. By far the most substantial artistic glow-up, however, is in the music. While Big Tabo had been the only composer on Lemon and Canary, Bokuten would see Sapporo Momoko pulling double duty as both artist and a musician, just as she had in the past of channel favorites such as Suisenka and Ayoyo-san. But for as much as I want to praise them on their individual merits, I cannot tell heads from tails here. While I did ask on Twitter if Momoko had any idea of who made what, according to her, the materials of those answers are lost to time, and the only thing that she knows for sure is Tabo wrote the great opening theme. I also haven't found any way to talk to Tabo about this since he basically seems to have disappeared. I do have some educated guesses based on correlating mixing styles and instrument choices with their other works, but without any concrete information, I don't want to risk my guesses being passed around as fact-checked by true Edo-gay patriots. With that out of the way, oh my fucking god, is Bokuten's soundtrack incredible. Every single track here, without fail, is beautifully composed and mastered with gorgeous instrument choices and incredible creativity, from the wistful and hopeful pianos of Northbound and Where Angels Fear to Tread. To the ethereal mixtures of electronic and acoustic sounds in A Melancholic Eden and Heaven's Prisoners. There are zero misses here. There's a truly incredible blending of styles too. Some are electronic in a way similar to Momoko's brilliant work on Suisenka and Sayonara o Oshiete, while others draw clear inspiration from the classic music of various Western European cultures. Some combine discordant strings of sleazy and jazzy stylings, while others blend traditional Japanese melodic ideas and structures with European orchestral stylings. It is a real melting pot that captures all the highs and lows of Westernization of the Taisho period, and worth listening to in full on its own, even if you never intend to play the game. It's worth noting too that the voice acting as well, like in Canary, is great, and we actually get credits this time. Though, as is typical for this channel, very few of the names are even vaguely known. Kanako's VA returns here to play Zakuro, and Suzuki Keiko from many key games including Planetarium and Little Busters plays Midoriko, but besides that, many aren't even in the industry anymore. It's a shame too, because everyone does a stellar job with their roles, especially Otake Soyu, who plays Yurino. And it is with this glowing praise that we transition into the fourth and final act of this video, where I take a dive into the deeper ideas, themes, and personal readings I came away from Bokuten with. Just as before, if you want to play this game yourself, I would recommend skipping ahead to the next non-spoiler segment wherein I wrap up all my thoughts. But if you wish to be here for the full ride, then let us head forward and gaze into the parts of the world which we all wish to forget. With 4 unique heroines and 13 endings explored in the course of just under 5 hours, Boku is a very, very dense game to read. And as such, like usual, please don't take this segment as a comprehensive examination of what it has to offer. In fact, think much the opposite, as there are threads of ideas I don't feel quite fit to explore and massive chunks of story that I don't have much to say on. So also like usual, this segment is going to primarily be about what I got from the game and what segments add to that. Like I said many times throughout this video, I broadly see Boku as being about acceptance. Acceptance of the impermanence of life, of what we don't understand, of the pains that we will experience and the joys that we will find and have found. The narrative behind all this is by no means a mystery, and it's very followable, but it does leave numerous things open for interpretation on both the smaller and larger scale, which I believe is all for the better. Perhaps the most direct instance of this comes in the story of Rosa. Ichizo first encounters her at the masquerade when Midoriko, who seems to have a vested interest in taking over the entire club, flaunts her on the stage as a foreign blonde beauty and takes the patrons by storm. Though she appears docile and sweet with a bit of a sadistic streak, her real colors show when a patron attempts to hit on her, and she, in response, slashes his face with her nails, causing the entire club to panic as Midoriko scrambles to damage control. Where everything takes a turn for Ichizo involving her, however, is when Midoriko, for reasons not completely clear at this point, prompts Ichizo with the offer to begin living with the two at her manor. It's there that he begins to take a liking to Rosa as the two start talking more and more, and he sneaks the young lady outside, charmed by her angelic allure and mysterious being, much to the frustration of Midoriko, who is insistent that her precious business partner never leave the manor. Believing her freedom to be of the utmost importance, Ichizo strikes a deal with Midoriko to trade Rosa for his beloved maiden ally Kome, and thus their playdates continue on, as Rosa asks Ichizo something new every single time they're out. She says she's older than him, and do you believe her? She says she's from an aristocratic family, and do you believe her? She says she can understand cats, and do you believe her? She says she's a witch, and do you believe her? Perhaps the questions are mere play, or perhaps there's something deeper. But whatever it is, it seems at least those brief glimpses out into a world beyond the cruel nightlife and stuffy manor give her happiness before her final moments. Just as quickly as she enters into Ichizo's world for a moment of impulse, she leaves it, being led out the window by a black cat that she had been torturing for days, and falling to her death unceremoniously. Was it fate or mere chance? Or perhaps that question could be asked about anything in her life. As she recalls, she was a normal and innocent child of a Jewish family in Germany until an incident during the November Revolution resulted in her parents being killed. Scared and alone in this world, she jumped from country to country as a stowaway, getting by for translation work and selling her body until she landed in Japan, where Midoriko took her in as a business partner and asset. But do you believe her? It's such a striking short story because we don't really get to understand anything about her in it, and the game itself, through both dialogue and choices, constantly reinforces the unreliability of her narratives. Rosa enters the game as a sadistic brat archetype, and any single bit of knowledge we could surmise from her is shrouded in mystery. Some of what she says are clearly a jest of someone who has never grown up, but some of it, such as her family history, is completely plausible. Even Midoriko seems to understand little about her and only makes things worse for an abusive relationship filled with isolations and beatings. The aimlessness of it all and the emphasis on uncertainty makes the few happy moments of the entire arc stronger. Playing at the park of Ichizo, going to the beach in a sundress, chasing after the stray cats, watching her lay gently on a bed, none of it feels planned or momentous, merely fragments of concrete joy in a life made up of nothing but disconnected experiences and doubts. This spontaneity pervades many of Bokuten's narratives, even in the ones that are far more complicated and planned. Midoriko's branch, for instance, though I have little to say on it outside of its relations to Rosa's, shows how even the best laid plans for life can go to waste in the blink of an eye. Her backstory that tells a traumatic and fractured childhood that haunts her until the game's present day, leaving her with a desire for revenge that she ultimately does sate only after embroiling countless people, and yet her life too ends in the blink of an eye to something she failed to account for. Like we saw in Canary, even the most secure life can crumble in an instant due to bad circumstances. But even in those which fall from grace and end unceremoniously, there is still happiness somewhere within them, fleeting moments of joy that make it worth living until the end calls upon you and you meet with God himself. That was a clever segue to begin talking about Yurino's path, which goes about as you would expect for something about a nun with unorthodox and amorous desires. Having anonymously donated to the orphanage and church she attends many years back, she and Ichizo have long kept up a correspondence with each other, but early on in the game, her letters begin hinting at darker desires of which she's deeply ashamed. These, as it would soon turn out, are passions for masochism of all sorts, from shameless exhibitionism to spanking, from whippings to shibari, and so much more. All of it has left her without a feeling of allyship to anyone except for the mysterious man who who has supported her all these years, and praying time and time again for God to cleanse her dirty body of sins. Though Ichizo feels as if he's too lowly to be in the presence of such an angelic woman, he ultimately decides to meet with her at her invitation, and quickly their relationship goes from merely amicable to completely lewd, as their shared interests and contrasting desires make them perfect for fulfilling each other's needs. Yurino feels as if she has found someone who truly accepts her, even if that very man cannot help but wonder if he's tainting someone far purer than him. It would not be long before everything goes south, however, as one particular morning he wakes up to a visit from his brother, who announces that his father has passed away. That is only part of the reason for his visit, however. The other is that he's heard a rumor of Ichizo's presence at the masquerade and believes that Yurino would be a perfect fit for the stage, the town's beloved nun defiled for everyone to watch, something to which Yurino agrees in order to repay debts to Ichizo's brother who had been supporting the church. Soon to be stripped of her faith once she leaves the stage, Ichizo meets with Zakudo for guidance on what he should do about Yurino, to which she simply tells him that he is the only thing Yurino has left in this world. To her, he is as a god. Without her faith, she is but a scared child who recoils at everything and clings onto him for guidance until the very end, and that end would soon come to her. When the two return to town following a venture in the forest, they're quickly spotted by the other nuns, who separate her from Ichizo and take them both in. Though they believe she is possibly beyond salvation, Ichizo offers to dedicate himself to work for the church in order to cleanse them both of their sins. And the moment that the head nun accepts this, another comes running into the office to deliver urgent news. Yurino has set fire to the church. Alone in the chapel halls, she screams, "If I cannot be by Ichizo's side, then I will sacrifice myself and return to his stead. It is the only place for which a sinner such as I can be." As she is set ablaze with the other nuns, Ichizo can do nothing but escape and watch the church burn down, remarking as it returns to ash, "I'm jealous of you, Yurino. For where am I, a man who is without God, to go?" If the kind of doubts that plague Rosa's branch are of a more factual and measurable kind, then what plagues Yurino's is of a far more spiritual kind. Questions of God and faith in a distinctly Christian favor that had penetrated the Japanese public conscious during the Taisho period. Though the religion was prohibited in Japan for the longest time, the very late 1800s, the tail end of the Meiji period, saw it becoming legally accepted and subsequently spreading from there. While the Christian establishments did a lot of good in the Taisho period, including the creation of private girls' high schools that were a legitimate step up from those the government sanctioned and aiming to aid the downtrodden such as brothel and factory workers, Christianity was still Christianity, and the beliefs of it regarding women were not all that far off from what the Meiji Civil Code had already been dictating. This includes, as always, the ideas regarding sex. Yurino's entire branch is plagued by an immense anxiety over what these desires in her mean, and that anxiety is certainly not unfounded. Though I did not grow up religious, I did grow up in the United States, which meant I experienced the horrible cultural sludge that spawned off of Christianity's views on sex everywhere. From members of my family during my very early youth, to shitty friends online in my teenage years, and even from ostensibly progressive people in my young adult years who couldn't shake the vestiges of purity culture, the ideas of no sex before or outside of marriage, virginity's incredible value, and the moral vileness of alternative sexual acts has led sex to never really be a straightforward subject in my life, or even a straight one, frankly. Of course, the humor in all this now is palpable, palpable even, being that for everything I was told about sluts going to hell and transgenders being Satan and porn rotting your brain and casual sex stalling your body so you may never find love or joy, guess who has a stable career, hobbies, and got married by being a slutty porn brain casual sex enjoying transgender? Whoopsie, a little fucky wucky happened there, didn't it? As I talked about in my spoiler segment for Canary though, all of those ideas didn't leave my brain just because I stopped believing in them or never believed in them in the first place. I've lived through a lot of shit with people treating me horribly for them, and that mix of the grander religious fervor of the concepts has made them things that stick in my brain from time to time. But beyond this, Yurino's feelings of being stranded from her faith simply for who she is felt real to me as someone who has long felt isolated from religious communities. I am by no means a Christian, or really anything I suppose. My beliefs start and end somewhere at there is a God, with the thousands of citations needed and caveats getting slowly filled out as I experience more and more of the world and learn from more and more people what they personally believe. I don't think any of what I feel is particularly esoteric, and perhaps someday if I ever actually make a video on Subadoshi Hibi, I'll talk more about it since that game actually aligns a lot with my beliefs, but what I want to address here is just how isolating it feels to try and figure out your spirituality without community. Religious belief is billed as something that people come together for, yet ever since realizing I was bisexual, I've had an unease around those communities, and that turned into full-on anxiety as a transgender person. I think anyone watching this video is familiar enough with the US religious right to understand why that is, but in case you don't, hate crimes and genocides are happening. It is a painful feeling to know you have some sort of faith, but that most people you may be able to express it to and learn from will always hang caveats over your head, because to them, those parts are not only inherently wrong somehow, but suffering is a testament to how much you love God and are willing to give up for him. I personally do not believe God gives a shit if someone enjoys being tied up in ropes and put on a cross for a spicy Saturday night, and I also really don't think he cares if people take hormones and dual-wield tits and dick. I honestly don't know how much God gives a shit about anything. To shamelessly borrow from Sibahibi, I think God is just something high up trying to guide people in mysterious ways, but it's not especially partial to our lives. It's just there, telling people to live happily, as contradictory, hypocritical, and baffling as that is. As worthless as that may make a God seem, I personally, and this is very personally, find that more comforting than the existential nightmare of predestination, the immense cruelty of only some being worthy of salvation, or the belief that there is no higher power. As a human, I am always going to be ruled by emotion and desire for connection deep down, a desire for explanations and something grander out there. And even if I know God probably doesn't exist and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially in my kind of incoherent and hacked together philosophy, if it's what it takes to make me feel more connected to the world and find a purpose within it, then perhaps it's okay to accept that. And so we reach Zakuro's story, the last branch of Bokuten. In it, Ichizo opts not to try and meet with Yurino, nor ever take sides with Midoriko and her brat companion, but instead to tread his own path in order to save Zakuro from her fate. He manages to convince the owner of the masquerade to let him take ownership of her on a loan, immediately leaving him saddled with debt that is impossible to pay off without resorting to using her body. Though he attempts his best, he cannot be sadistic enough to please the cruel audiences, nor even her it seems, as she constantly asks for and desires greater and greater pains and humiliations. To her, as someone born below everyone else, someone with the karma of a mere worm and nowhere near close to a human, it is simply destiny for her to only live for suffering. Day by day, their situation becomes more and more bleak. Much to Ichizo's agony, he continues to have Zakuro participate in more and more destructive forms of pleasure, and the last of his fortunes dry up. Forced into a split decision by the always lurking Midoriko to decide if he would face destitution, join with her, or sell Koumei in exchange for having his debts paid. Deciding to stake it out on his own, Ichijo chooses to say farewell to his beloved maid and gives her one final moment of closeness before returning to Zakuro's stead to declare his intention. They're going to leave Japan and head for Manchukuo. It was a region of China occupied by Japan from 1931 to 1945, promised by the government as somewhere people in struggling time could find incredible riches if they dared to venture in. The reality for most was anything but.
While many Manchukuo advertisements depicted the state as a utopia, in reality, Manchuria experienced one of the worst forms of Japanese brutalities during the 15-year war. Although many affluent Japanese and Westerners experienced luxury as visitors and residents, most locals could barely survive. The Japanese abused and exploited the Chinese throughout the occupation. Many locals were forced to give up their farms to Japanese settlers and live in ruin. Most Japanese colonists, who were promised abundant land, food, and resources, also struggled to survive.
Such is the world which Ichizo now finds himself in, a land ravaged by oppressive rule with the only escape from the brutal working and living conditions being a glass of the cheapest liquor money can buy. And Ichizo, now falling further and further ill to an infection, barely scraping by on his income, wants nothing more of it to escape at all. In a matter of no time, he builds up a massive debt to the local bar and burns through what few finances he has that aren't going to his medication and basic needs. In order to survive, Zakuro ends up working as a server in the bar, but even that is merely lessening the blow of Ichizo's ever-growing spending. It's not before long that she has to return to the exact thing which Ichizo wished to save her from, and she spends a night servicing the Imperial soldiers. Pained and embarrassed at what his lover had to fall to because of his own vices, Ichizo decides to take one final step out into the world in hopes of gaining something better. He decides to head north with her. To where he doesn't know. To what he doesn't know. All he knows is that if they keep going, if they keep running, there will be some happiness for her out there. There is some joy he could perhaps finally give her, if he just keeps going north. Of all the endings, Zakuro's final ending is maybe the one that affected me the most as I was reading the game. The slow escalation from an impulsive whim to save somebody who may not even wish to be saved, to running aimlessly in hopes of giving the one he loves the most a chance at joy while he lays near dead in the snow, is such a horrifically tragic and impactful conclusion to one of the game's most thought-provoking characters. Zakuro is complex in that she is perhaps the only heroine, besides the pseudo-heroine Koumei, who does not actively despise her current circumstances. While Yurino suffered under the weight of losing her faith, Rosa had been taken from bad situation to bad situation, and Midoriko's entire life was effectively a revenge tragedy, Zakuro is outwardly fine with her situation at all points, even when the two reach agonizing destitution in Manchukuo. Whether that or the masquerade is worse is uncertain, but even at the latter, she constantly tells Ichizo in the most peaceful and at ease tone imaginable that she is fine being there. She is, in her words, a simple masochist. And therefore, the way she is treated there, which includes death by crucifixion and being sold as human livestock and some bad endings, is perfectly fine for for her, desirable even. After all, it is the pain she bore when obtaining her whole back tattoo which first made her feel alive. And there's a conundrum here, isn't there? On one hand, Zakuro is very likely someone who is trafficked into the sex trade, as during the very late 1800s into the early Taisho period, there were people who were taking women to and from the various Asian countries, so it's rather likely she was taken into Japan for these purposes, passed around from owner to owner as many Eurasian women were. But on the other hand, Zakuro seems more than content with her situation and shows no interest in really changing it. She only goes along with what Ichizo, legally her owner in her branch, wishes to do with her to bring her happiness. In his mind, that is to live out a life which is more typical, as husband and wife, peacefully and quietly, thus saving her from sex work. And while I think it's impossible to argue that the conditions of her work aren't inhuman, there's an undertone to his speech that such work and desires are in and of themselves wrong. It mirrors both views around the unacceptability of sex work as valid work in and of itself, and of certain forms of sexual desire being misguided manifestations of trauma, both of which are things that people must be saved from, so they may be restored to their natural state. And if it's not obvious, both of those are clearly untrue. For the former, sex work is simply labor. What produces the view that it is improper or not work is not anything innate to it, but the ways in which various societal forces demean it as vulgar and disgusting, and various legal forces attempt to obscure and stigmatize it. It is through these forces that people are forced into it, upwards of 70% in some countries being immigrants trying to find better lives, and those who perform it because it meets their needs better are so heavily disadvantaged. But it must be noted that there truly are many people who prefer it to other forms of labor, those who do it simply to make money, and others who are forced into it. They are people who do not need a prince galloping in to save them, but people who need major reforms to social safety nets, job possibilities, and regulations that allow them to practice their work safely and enter and exit it as desired safely. What we have now is a labor situation that makes it often dangerous for those forced in it to escape, offers few alternatives that work as well for those who wish to leave, and forces all of them into far more dangerous situations and clients in order to survive. In other words, sex work is labor that has no labor protections. For the latter issue, unorthodox sexual desires, which is to say anything that people would not consider vanilla, are far more complex than just trauma problems. While trauma can increase the chances and severity of unorthodox sexual desires in people, people can also simply have unorthodox desires and fantasies independent of it. It is far from an easy thing to determine why people enjoy what they do, which can make it really frustrating when people believe they can. This particular discussion, despite gender identity being different from sexual preferences, is one that inevitably shifts around to trans people in modern discourse. Compared to cisgender peers, we generally suffer from far greater rates of childhood trauma due to increased risks of poverty, bullying, sexual harassment, and countless other shitty things that only get more compounded by further minority markers. It is immensely easy, and in fact very common, for anti-trans activists to pull the traumatized angle and say that we're people with shallow brain beings led astray who need counseling for horrible lives to return us back to normalcy. Because surely we do not have the agency to understand our own bodies, to understand our own desires as they are, right? Surely it is not acceptable for us to do what works for us in the moment and to provide comfort that allows us to sort ourselves out and decide where to go from there, right? Obviously, it is an indignity that so much of society believes so many marginal people are just incapable of understanding what they're doing with themselves simply because we have chosen to live lives that are not deemed good, that are not deemed to fall within a restrictive, brutal, and punishing norm. In any circumstance, we should have the right to decide what is correct for our bodies to meet our desires, so as long as we aren't harming anyone. Something that generally only happens because we are so often denied legal and working safe ways to live the lives the way we want to. And yet, at the same time as all this, I myself can't deny that I sometimes wonder just how much of my identity and how much of my desire comes from nature, nurture, or neglect. Even if it would not change the material reality of my experience, for as long as I have been aware of my fixations, my fantasies, and my desired body and image of myself, I have wanted to understand why. In the end, I don't know if I will ever see the answer to this. I cannot account for everything I've seen in my life, everything that I have been through, everything that I have been bewitched by, everything that is innate, and say what came from where and why. I have wanted other people to solve it for me, and I've wanted other people to stay away from it and leave it vague as it is. But as I write this now, I cannot say with any confidence whether I am broken or a simple masochist. So, at the end of this all, what have we been left with but a pile of questions and uncertainties? The characters we can hardly understand, lives that happen for reasons unclear, abandonments that seem as if unhumanly cruel, and promises of prosperity turned into cold, dying breaths. Book 10's narrative, throughout all 13 of its endings, offers no true peace or closure. Life simply happens, beginning and ending on whims that only God, if God exists, can understand. But I think the tying knot to this all is a segment unlocked after clearing every other node in the game. Komei's journal, taking place in a separate timeline from the other paths. In it, we learn from her writings some decade after the time the game takes place in, what her life was and came to. Born to an affair between a rich man and his maid, she came into this world partially blinded to amblyopia, living a life in the shadows of a prosperous and fortunate household with only her mother at her side. At age 10, however, her mother passed away, where she revealed to Komei the name of Komei's father and her half-brother, Ichizo. Together from then, they lived under one roof without him ever knowing any better, and though times may have been hard, she could not have wished for anything more than the two to keep living together. But like a curse, Ichizo fell greatly ill in his 30s, with his health becoming worse and worse. Before long, he could no longer even recognize who Komei was, nor see her. And 20 years later, after his last breath, Komei lays on her bed, awaiting the same fate, for the bright light to caress her gently and lovingly. It's a short, simple, and powerful ending with incredible prose that I believe truly sells the idea of acceptance through its most ultimate form, the end of life. Komei lives her last moments not in agony, but in acceptance of the life that had happened. It was far from perfect, it was filled with hardships and miseries, but within it all were moments of joys and hopes for happiness that nothing can ever take away. In this, I feel Boku accomplishes exploring what it takes to move forward in a way Canary didn't through its focus on hope. Though I believe hope is something people need to move forward, it is also fragile. It can vanish in an instant, and the world around us is filled with stories where it goes nowhere. Civilizations ultimately ruined by brutal and unrelenting empires, lives ended in what seemed like meaningless ways, and tragedies that seem as if they should have never been allowed to occur. Hope is for everyone, but it is also an inherently uncertain thing that relies on us accepting the world as it is and hoping that it can change. And that is not easy. I myself cannot deny that for however much I talk on this channel about it and push it to other people, there have been many times I felt that I was not going to be able to find happiness. There were many times I resigned myself to a life of unfulfillment, believing all that was in store for me was a horrible ending. What Boku offers is a glimpse at a world of these unhappy endings, a series of painful and cruel realities painted by the systems of long ago that still affect us today. People living in search of revenge, of forgiveness, of happiness, of truth that never comes to them. It is not merely for show that all of Boku 13 endings are bad, it is crucial to the story itself. To me, Boku is about the importance of learning to accept that life is truly not in our control. Whether you are ruled by untamable instinct or aim for a singular goal, whether you are certain in yourself or rely on a higher power to guide you, life can end as spontaneously as it can begin, and everything before, during, and after those points is guided by an immense web that feels nigh incomprehensible. In this way, it seems easier to deny it all and live in ignorance. You can try and say that all of it is preordained and those who suffer deserve it. You can try and deny your identity to fit into a social norm, chastising others with similar struggles to get ahead. You can live for power and cheat your way through, so you have to face as little of the injustice as possible. You can escape this reality through so many vices and convince yourself that you are headed on the true path. And while some can live in those delusions comfortably, many of us aren't afforded that opportunity. Many of us are forced to face the cruelty of the system societies have created, and many of us are born in ways that don't even allow us the chance to become normal. Society tries to force us to see a bad ending as our only possible ending, an inevitability of the world we live in, and to fall into despair or deny it. We may be our only point of view, but we are not the heroes or heroines of this world. We are merely people navigating an ever-complicating landscape, and within that landscape lays as much beauty as there is awfulness. And not all of us will meet happy endings. It is inevitable that some of us will meet horrible ends, and we cannot turn our eyes away from that. We must make peace with it. We must face it head on, while accepting that the tragedies are not inevitable. Fate is a mere myth. None of us are destined to suffer because of how we were born. It is the systems of the world, the systems that are explained by our histories, that attempt to dictate what will happen to us. If we can accept that this, not some innate uncleanliness, is what destroys us, then we can hope to destroy them. We can accept that however much it hurts to push forward, that we are not helpless, and so we can hope to find happiness. We can hope with others for it. History shows that even the most downtrodden of us have the power to understand and change the world. There is much we cannot control in our lives, and we must accept that. But there's just as much that we can, and through unity we can make up for the deficit. We have the power to see that even within the lives that end far too soon, there is still joy within them, and that it is our job as those living to fight tooth and nail to protect that joy and avert further tragedies. If we can join together in our shared struggles, rather than push each other away over petty bullshit ideas created precisely to tear us apart, then we can frighten even the most horrifying monsters. What we cannot control alone, we can together. Of course, it's easier said than done. Though I know there is reason in the world for what I am and what has happened to me, I may very well never know it. I will forever have to carry with me the yearning to understand myself and the world I exist under, knowing well it may never be fulfilled in full. But it is no reason to give in to the lies of power and to turn my back on myself and others. I can accept that I will always be full of yearning and mysteries just as the world is. Because I know that no matter how hard I fall, no matter how hard the world falls, there will always be other people to take my hand and show me comfort I never knew I needed. So I, in turn, can hold my hand out for others and show them love, and perhaps we can pull the world back up. I will find the strength again and again to persevere and push for something better, as so many people now and throughout history have. As I write this, one of the world's greatest superpowers has taken a turn for the far worst. I feel as if I have lost a home that never loved me, but a home nonetheless. I can't deny that I'm scared for the world, and I honestly don't know where it'll head, but that doesn't mean I'll give up. I know that there will always be joy, and I'll try my hardest to fight for it. I'll do my best to encourage people to believe the same and show the world that their existence matters, that we are not doomed to bad endings. There is so much I don't know, and among them it is why I'm certain of this, that I know we can make it if we can accept all the world, that I know that we can find hope. At the end of it all, would I recommend Utsuro's digital Taisho plays? Well, if it isn't already clear, abso-fucking-lutely. Clocking it at under 10 hours combined with an average reading speed, Boku and Canary are two of the most fascinating, inventive, and enthralling stories the medium has to offer, with some incredible visuals and music to boot. And the good news is that Boku at the very least is accessible thanks to a digital release on DL site. At 4,000 yen, it is a little expensive for such an old title, but I think you get your money's worth out of it, and it's certainly a far better deal than the 20,000 yen that physical copies can sell for. Canary's situation, though, is unfortunately far worse, as it doesn't have a digital release. The only ways to get it are through a box set with Lemon, which sells for over 10k yen, or purchasing all of the games it was bundled with for around 4k yen. Suffice to say, neither of those options are exactly preferable, and even as someone with a whole shelf of tits, dick, and ass, I do not find that preferable. So all I can do is hope and pray by a stroke of luck that this video manages to reach the right people to get the games up for sale. I really think people would eat Canary up at 1,500 yen or something, given the sheer amount of thrills and energy it manages to stuff into a bite-sized package. Above all, however, I just want to see Utsuro be given the means necessary to return to this universe and expand on it further, perhaps telling the stories of the other 4 heroines from Lemon who haven't yet gotten an opportunity to be in the spotlight. He did get the chance in 2014 after all to produce an unrelated Taisho-era work with Momoko returning as composer, so it's certainly possible. As it stands though, however you must get your hands on these 2 games, I cannot recommend doing so enough. They are incredible explorations of a vibrant and tumultuous period of time, with powerful themes of hope and acceptance that still ring true to this day, along with so many other ideas I just barely scraped the surface of. I hope these games get a translation because there really is something for everyone here. And of core messages as powerful yet simple as they are, I feel what these titles have to say has only gotten more important with time. Hold your hand out and never stop facing the world as it is. Never give up hope.